All right, I think we're all set up here. Okay, so welcome. My name is Keyrsten. I'm a registered holistic nutritionist with Muscles and Mindset, and I work with our clients on all of their nutrition stuff. And a big part of nutrition for me personally, and with my clients, is a focus on intuitive eating. And for a long time, this wasn't a huge focus for me with nutrition, either personally or with my clients. But when I was working with clients and, thinking about nutrition for myself, I always felt like there was something missing. And so with some research and sort of how my practice has evolved, now intuitive eating is such a big part of how I work with clients. And I really felt like it was that puzzle piece that I was missing, both for myself, like I said, and with clients. So what the heck is intuitive eating? What does it mean to be an intuitive eater? This is a term that I think is floating around a lot these days, but what I want to talk about today is what that actually means and how you can start to take steps towards being more of an intuitive eater. So we're going to really quickly kind of give the definition of intuitive eating, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. But really what I want to focus on today are some steps you can leave with. So I want you to have some things that you can sort of take with you, again, on that journey towards being more of an intuitive eater. So what is intuitive eating? It's really working to break free from any negative emotions that we feel around food. So a couple of emotions that I hear clients talk a lot about in reference to food is shame and guilt. So working to break free from the shame or guilt or whatever other negative emotions come up for you around food. It's about an approach to food and nutrition that doesn't include calorie counting or looking at nutrition and our diet from a place of food restriction. It's also about following guidelines that really promote mindfulness and intuition to help guide our choices. So really it's about starting to tune into what feels good and what doesn't. It's really key to start thinking about if you actually feel physically hungry right now, or if you're choosing to eat for different reasons. And again, it's about thinking about what nourishes you and what no longer serves you, throwing away all of the rules, the things we hear about nutrition from our friends, from our family, from diet culture, from society, throwing all of that out and making decisions based on what works for you and your body. So what feels good for you and your body. And the first step in moving towards intuitive eating is just the tuning in. Now, this is both the easy part and the hard part. That's what I always say. It's easy because you don't necessarily have to do anything, but becoming aware of your patterns around food and starting to notice these patterns without judgment, starting to listen to your body, that can feel really hard. That can feel really challenging, and that can feel really uncomfortable. So it's really, we want to think about it as like a muscle that you have to work, and it's a practice that needs to be developed. I always say it's kind of like meditation. You don't just sit down and immediately you're amazing at meditation. It takes time. It takes practice. It takes a consistent effort to be able to develop those skills. And intuitive eating is a lot like that. So that's really the first step, the tuning in part. So starting to listen to your body, what works and what doesn't. But I wanted to focus on two key principles of intuitive eating today to kind of get you started, that I think are really, really important in developing intuitive eating skills. And so you feel like you have a few specific things that you're leaving with today that you can start to focus on. And those two things are identifying our hunger and fullness cues. That's number one. And the second is how to address emotional eating, because this is something that often comes up a lot. Okay, so the first key intuitive eating principle, like I mentioned, is all about honoring your fullness and hunger cues. And I think it's really important before we get into this conversation to note that being hungry isn't bad. It's actually really good to feel hungry. This is a sign that our metabolic function and our hormones are working well. So feeling hungry isn't bad. And often when I talk with clients about this, they kind of feel like being hungry is negative. So just keep this in mind when you're focusing on this. Being hungry isn't bad. So the key with identifying hunger signals to begin with is to start to question whether you're actually truly physically hungry or biologically hungry, you might hear it called, or when you're eating or feeling hungry for other reasons, like if you're frustrated, if you're sad, if you're anxious, if you're bored, if there's a really delicious cake on the table that you want a piece of. So what's the difference and how do you tell? So how do we know if we're physically or biologically hungry, or if we're eating for other reasons? So I'm going to give you a few things to think about to kind of differentiate this. The first is that emotional hunger tends to come on really suddenly. So it kind of hits you in an instant, it feels overwhelming, and it feels urgent. On the flip side, physical hunger tends to come on much more gradually. Emotional hunger typically craves very specific foods, usually comfort foods. When you're physically hungry, usually almost anything sounds good, including the healthy, nutritious stuff like vegetables. Emotional hunger often leads to mindless eating. So before you know it, you've eaten the whole bag of chips or the whole thing of ice cream. An example I always use is, if you've ever kind of sat down and you're, stressed from the day and you're eating dinner in front of the TV and you look down and your plate's empty, but you didn't sort of remember that experience. When you're eating in response to physical hunger, you're typically more aware of what you're doing. Emotional hunger isn't satisfied once you're full. So often we tend to keep wanting more and more, eating until we're uncomfortable and stuffed. Physical hunger, on the other hand, we tend to stop eating when we're more satisfied. Emotional hunger isn't always located in the stomach, so we're not getting those physical cues like, a growling stomach or that kind of physical feeling in your digestive system. And then lastly, emotional hunger often leads to negative feelings. So often when we're eating emotionally, afterwards we'll feel things like regret or guilt or shame around the food choices that we just made. When we're eating to satisfy physical hunger, you're unlikely to feel those things because you're simply just giving the body what it needs. So those are some tips to start to think about, okay, am I actually physically hungry? Am I hungry in a different way? Or am I choosing to eat for a different reason? So once you started to figure out which of those two things it is, you can consider a hunger scale. So if it's like, okay, yes, I am physically hungry, we want to think about hunger on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is painfully hungry. 10 is painfully full, like post-Thanksgiving dinner, you need to unbutton your pants kind of full. 5 is neutral. So we do want to allow ourselves to feel hungry physically, but we want to kind of stay moderate. So if we're thinking about that hunger scale of 1 to 10, we want to sort of remain in the neutral middle. So between 3 and 7-ish as much as possible. If we get too hungry, we often have a more difficult time being mindful and intuitive of our hunger choices around food. And we don't want to eat until we're too full because then we often feel physically uncomfortable. And we've all probably experienced this to some degree, like when you're really hungry, all those intentions of moderate, conscious, nutritious eating are totally out the window. We tend to eat just about anything. For me, it's always hello carbohydrates, and we tend to eat more than we need. So we tend to overeat. So how I would suggest you focus on this in the real world is each time you go to eat, ask yourself, okay, am I actually physically hungry right now? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, what's my hunger level? So thinking about that scale of 1 to 10 and really start to just check in with yourself around this at regular intervals throughout the day to kind of develop that awareness. So that's the hungry side. On the flip side, we also want to listen for signs that your body tells you you're no longer hungry. So again, on that hunger scale, like stopping eating when you're around a 6 or a 7. So looking for those signs that you're comfortable, you're satisfied. Pause in the middle of your meal or snack and ask yourself how your food is tasting. So bringing awareness to your meal and what your current fullness level is. So again, it's just kind of about checking in and yeah, just focusing on this stuff a little bit more throughout the day. So the second intuitive eating principle that I wanted to touch on today is coping with emotions with kindness and trying to find other ways to support our emotional health without food. Now, we've all eaten emotionally before, and it's totally okay to do that sometimes. It's not about never doing it, but it's about noticing when we are doing it and working on the negative feelings that we have around it, as well as trying to find some other ways to address our emotional health throughout the day. So there are some questions that you might consider to determine if emotional eating is present, to try and kind of get to the bottom of it. So here are a few things. Do you eat more when you're feeling stressed? This is a big one for me. So I notice that if I've had a really stressful day, if I'm not really mindful, I tend to just get snacky, and it's kind of like my response to stress throughout the day is like, I work from home. So it's like, open the fridge, open the pantry. So that might be something to think about. Do you ever eat when you're not hungry or eat when you're really, really full? Do you eat to feel better? So maybe to calm or soothe yourself when you're sad, mad, bored, anxious, whatever. Do you ever reward yourself with food? And do you ever feel powerless or out of control around food? And that's what I hear a lot from clients. They feel like they don't trust themselves around food. And that's because their eating behavior is often stemming from emotions and not actually based on whether they're truly physically hungry or not. So do you eat more when you're stressed? Do you eat when you're not hungry or when you're overly full? Do you eat to feel better? Do you reward yourself with food? And do you feel powerless or out of control around food? And so the idea here is first to notice, and then second, to find ways to address these emotional issues without using food all the time. So I have a couple of strategies around this. So the first thing is to start to investigate the difference between physical and emotional hunger, as we talked about. Am I physically hungry? If yes, honor your hunger, go on your way. If not, what am I feeling? And this can be introspective, but I find sometimes journaling can really help to kind of create a little bit more structure around this and formalize it a little bit. So thinking about, okay, if I'm not hungry, why do I feel like eating? What actually do I need? Is it rest? Is it space? Is it something to do if you're bored? Whatever it might be. So that's first. Start to investigate the difference between physical and emotional hunger. Second, I do find it helps to have really good nutritious options available to satisfy those cravings that can come up. So both having something that's sweet and savory while you're working out some of the why behind your patterns, eliminating all your go-to foods altogether is not going to be helpful. So what we can do to help in the interim is focus on better quality, more nutritious options. So having like fruit or dried fruit, almond butter, dark chocolate around, having some like sweet potato chips or something kind of salty, crunchy around, so that if you those cravings are coming up when you're stressed or when you've had a bad day, you still have something around that you can go to. And then the last tip here is not exactly food related, but it's looking to nourish yourself in other ways. And there really is no one size fits all here, but instead of always turning to food when you're experiencing something emotionally, thinking about maybe creating some more time for rest and relaxation, getting outside for some fresh air, going for a walk, walking down to the beach to watch the sunset, listening to music, doing a meditation, journaling, whatever feels good. I mean, again, there's no one size fits all here. What works for one person here might not work for somebody else. But what I would encourage you to do is really look to nourish yourself in other ways that don't involve food. So to wrap things up, one more piece of homework for you. I want you to think about an affirmation or an intention that you could focus on that highlights or describes the kind of a relationship with food that you want to develop, establish, or sort of nurture. Write it down and put it in a spot where you can focus on it throughout the day. And I think this just really helps to bring it back to why you're doing all of this in the first place. Like, what's the reason why this is important for you? And it's really focusing back on, developing the positive relationship with food that you want. So that is our little Intelligent Intuitive Eating 101 training. Let us know if you have any questions about intuitive eating. You can put them in the comments here. And also let us know what else you want to learn about that might help you to be a more intuitive eater. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you soon.